Alright everyone, link in the description to RCP of course, and of course by the time you see it, I mean days later potentially, it might have changed, but it looks like we've got to do some poll analysis because I think that Trump has found his bottom. I think that his polling has hit its floor, and his floor is probably around 41, 42. That's pretty good. His old floor was in the low 30s, actually. A floor represents, within a polling aggregate, if you just look at the trend line, you have to have a lot of data points long term. You can't do this if you've got very limited data. You can see it begin to flatten at certain points. You can have a ceiling or a floor. A ceiling is the point at which you get to a high point, and it looks like it's being pulled back down when it goes above it, and it starts to form a line, a little squiggly line. You're seeing that, I think, begin to form at around 41, 42, which means that that's the point at which, if his approval falls further, its statistical noise intends to buoy back up. There's resistance to it falling further. That represents an overwhelming majority of Republicans, certain people who are conservative but not partisan in nature, and a chunk of independents altogether. That's a fairly large number of people. If it were just Republicans, it would be somewhere in the upper 30s, potentially. There's an additional block of people that have solidified, in my mind, behind Trump. This is something that I do not believe Biden has. He doesn't have a mandate even in party, whereas Trump has the highest approval of any Republican president ever in party. He's got virtually all the Republicans sewn up, and there's an additional 5 points or so that are not accounted for in that partisan core. These are people who lean to the right ideologically, certain independents, and would-be third-partyists. That's a pretty high floor to be at. He only needs to gain 4 or 5 points beyond his floor in order to be within the range of electability. The magic number is usually said to be 47. I think it can go a bit lower and be 45, 46 and still lead to electability. He's within 3 or 4 points of that in the aggregate right now. And keep in mind that's his floor. That's the low point. That's the point at which he is probably not going to fall further. We've seen resistance at that level before. If that's his hardened fan base, it's going to be very difficult, barring a massive catastrophe, for him to actually get fully knocked out. A candidate sort of gets knocked out if they fall down into the mid-30s or so. This close to an election, that would probably be the end, essentially, for his ability to be reelected. It doesn't look like he'll get anywhere near that. Keep in mind the situation. You've got a technical recession, a lot of people out of work, missing rent payments and so forth right now. The risk of mass homelessness, by the way, at the moment, unless Congress acts. And the Democrats can claim all day that the evil Republicans are standing in their way. I don't see them making any proposals that don't involve UBI, so that's not going to happen. Fuck off, essentially. The Democrats would rather let people starve than actually pass a reasonable extension to essentially the bailout of the public because of their own artificial bullshit with regards to coronavirus. By the way, it's their fucking fault for their lockdowns. You got technically a recession. You've got a pandemic that, although it's under control and everyone's fine for the most part, it's perceived of as being out of control because of the third reason, which is legacy media propaganda. There is right now an unprecedented propaganda campaign by the U.S. government's insiders, what you would colloquially term the deep state, between the deep state and corporate billionaires. It takes place on social media. It takes place in the news, like the newspapers, TV. And it's unprecedented. It's a propaganda campaign. It's being spawned by a bunch of neoliberals who they honestly hate Trump. I think they honestly hate him because he comes from the donor class and therefore they can't buy and sell him. And the fact that he's got more of an independent idea of how to do things is why even the Republicans have stood in his way repeatedly. Even Fox doesn't like Trump. Don't let him fucking kid you. They want the ratings by pretending to be more for him than CNN, but it's a pile of steaming horseshit. It's overwhelmingly negative coverage of a person who, by and large, has buoyed the economy up, cannot directly respond to coronavirus much at all, because it's largely in the states' hands. You see, we're not a dictatorship like most other countries. We're not a heavily top-down federal supremacy system like some countries are, and therefore the response is different. This is both a strength and a weakness at different times depending on what's happening in the country. So you got nonstop propaganda, a pandemic, economic downturn. You've got turmoil in other parts of the world now too. And yet his approval is reasonably high. It's in the low 40s. That's pretty good. He doesn't... Think about it. He must be doing something right to be at that point. And this isn't the aggregate, of course. When you say, well, this poll shows him at 35, it doesn't matter. And Rasmussen shows him at, what, 45 or something. That's wrong, too. It's an outlier. Always make sure to look at the aggregate. People are always telling me, well, Sticks, you're not supposed to, the polls are always wrong. Not aggregates. The aggregates in 2016 were reasonably appropriate. There was only a couple of points of tilt there in the final results as opposed to the aggregate. It was like 2.4 if I remember correctly. That's fairly accurate. That's pretty good. No individual polling firm should be considered accurate. I know people are saying, well, in 2016, Rasmussen was the most accurate. And then they tried to use Rasmussen in the 2018 midterms, and they got fucked over. I remember there were people that made that mistake. Again, use aggregates, not individual polls. Aggregates can be good. Single polls are bullshit. Trump's approval has probably stabilized at a level that some presidents struggle to maintain. There are plenty of times that both Trump in the past and his forebears, like Obama and Bush, were well below 42. I would be reasonably confident that Trump will be reelected because if I assume the economy moves in a positive direction, and I do, assuming that Congress doesn't deliberately destroy the economy by causing mass homelessness in a couple of months, which might be Pelosi's idea. You can blame her if that happens. Assuming the economy tends to recover, coronavirus does not become a totally out-of-control scenario, and people will lose interest, by the way, and that when they realize that they don't know anyone that died of coronavirus, they'll start scratching their heads a little bit. What am I so fucking afraid of? I'm tired of wearing a mask in 110-degree heat. As things get better, as rioters are slowly ground down by arrests and finally put in a cell with Bubba, on federal charges, by the way, totally different. See, the reason why they're pissed off about the feds operating in Portland isn't because they're actually worried about dictatorship. It's because they're worried that the federal charges won't be dropped, that the federal government will actually keep these people in jail, and the rioters will slowly dry up and die. They'll be afraid of getting 10, 15 years in the clink, and so they'll go home. That's what these idiot leftists are afraid of. If I assume a generally positive trajectory, I would assume that his approval will start to rise again. If it goes back to its old rate of rise, he was hitting almost 48 not that long ago. I think that if he's at that level in the high 40s, he gets reelected fairly easily. The matchup polls showed him out ahead of Biden at many times around that period when he was peaking, and there's no reason to believe he hit a ceiling. The thing is, his ceiling might be in the 50s. That's reasonably good. Most presidents aren't going into re-election with approval ratings like that. Some, they get fucked and don't get re-elected, like Jimmy Carter or Herbert Walker. Or W. Technically he didn't win the first time around. Gore, technically speaking, did win that election. He did get fucked by Florida, in all honesty. Not that it would have done any better. Can you imagine Gore on 9/11? He wouldn't have been any better than Bush. He would have done the same fucking shit. He would have been told, wow, this is a golden opportunity for you to make a good speech and go bomb people, and we'll test out all of our new toys out in the desert. Wow, said Al Gore, that sounds like a great idea. I know that he would have, by the way. He would have been just as warmongering as W. He just would have been a little less cavalier about it. He wouldn't have flown into the aircraft carrier and said, mission accomplished. It'd be the only difference. There'd be less bravado involved. So yeah, that's a little bit of poll analysis here. 41-42, roughly stable. It can go a little lower or a little higher, but I would expect it to remain linear for a while before it begins probably to recover. And if he stalls out, like let's say it's still at 42 on election day, of course he'd lose. I don't think that's likely to happen. You tend to have a narrowing in polls anyway close to an election. We haven't had the debates yet though, so anything could happen. That's about all. Peace out.